John Lennon and Barry Gibb. Two absolute titans of songwriting, the guys who wrote the soundtrack for a generation. For more than 50 years, their stories have felt like they were running on parallel tracks, their legacies defining popular music. You had the Beatles, a force of nature that completely reshaped the world. And you had the Bee Gees, the brotherhood of harmony that conquered the globe with melodies that are just eternal. They were contemporaries, they were competitors, and they were two of the biggest names in 20th century culture for decades. Fans have wondered about the relationship between these two musical giants. Was it some kind of silent, simmering rivalry between the biggest bands on the planet? A quiet, mutual respect between two masters of their craft? Or, in the chaos of global fame, was there just nothing there at all? The world was left to guess, filling in the blanks with myths. But now, after years of offering only brief, cryptic stories, Barry Gibb, the last brother standing, has finally, at age 78, broken his silence. He's decided to speak on his one, and only, direct encounter with John Lennon. And the story, the truth of what happened in that moment, is not at all what you'd expect. To really get the weight of this single, brief moment between two men, we have to go back in time. Back to a world shaking with change, where pop music wasn't just entertainment, it was a cultural revolution, broadcast at 45 RPM. In the 1960s, two powerful musical empires were being built. One was forged in the gritty, post-war city of Liverpool. The other, under the sunny skies of Australia, though its roots were also in the north of England first, the Beatles. It's hard to even find the words to describe their impact. They weren't just a band, they were a phenomenon. John, Paul, George, and Ringo were like the four horsemen of a new cultural age, one that tore down the old world and rebuilt it with creativity, wit, and a sound no one had ever heard before. From the raw energy of their early gigs at the Cavern Club to the mind-bending masterpieces of their later years, the Beatles didn't just follow trends, they were the trend. And John Lennon, the group's sharp-tongued, intellectual, and often rebellious core, was a new kind of rock star. He was a poet and a provocateur who used his platform not just to sing about love, but to question war, challenge conformity, and search for something deeper. By 1967, the Beatles weren't just the biggest band in the world, they were living at a level of fame so insane, so high up, that almost no one else could breathe the same air. Meanwhile, on the other side of the planet, another musical dynasty was rising. The Bee Gees, a brotherhood connected by blood and an almost supernatural gift for harmony. Barry Gibb, the eldest, and his younger twin brothers, Robin and Maurice, had been perfecting their craft since they were kids. They started in Manchester, but their families' move to Australia set them on a path of relentless hard work. Barry, even as a teenager, was a pop prodigy who just got melody. While the Beatles were leading the British invasion, the Gibbs were dominating the Australian charts, their sound evolving from polished pop to soulful, emotional ballads. Their harmonies were flawless, a genetic miracle no other band could copy. When the Bee Gees returned to England in 1967, they weren't rookies. They were pros with a bunch of hits in Australia, ready to take on the world. Their manager, Robert Stigwood, boldly branded them the most significant new talent of 1967. It was a direct challenge thrown down in the middle of the hyper-competitive London music scene. And it worked. Songs like New York Mining Disaster 1941 and To Love Somebody were instant, massive hits. The music was different from the Beatles' work, more orchestral, more openly emotional, but it had a melodic genius that was impossible to ignore. The world now had two songwriting powerhouses. The Beatles were the undisputed kings, the revolutionaries. The Bee Gees were the new princes, the masters of the epic pop ballad. They were two planets orbiting the same sun of global superstardom, but on their own brilliant, distinct paths. Their trajectories were bound to cross, but how that would go down was anyone's guess. In the world of 1960s pop, second place wasn't an option. The press, the fans, the industry, everyone thrived on competition. If the Beatles were the champs, then every hot new band was a potential challenger. The Rolling Stones were the dangerous alternative. The Kinks were the witty English storytellers. So when the Bee Gees showed up and immediately started topping the charts, they were instantly cast in that same role. The comparisons were non-stop. It was an easy story to write. Both groups had brotherly bonds. Both were built on incredible songwriting teams. Lennon and McCartney were the most famous duo in history. The brothers Gibb were a triple threat. In fact, as a songwriter, Barry Gibb would eventually tie a massive record with John Lennon and Paul McCartney for writing the most consecutive #1 hits on the Billboard Hot 100, each of them penned 6. That alone puts him in the same stratosphere, a detail that often gets lost. Critics sometimes lazily labeled the Bee Gees' early sound as Beatles-esque, which was basically a catch-all for any British band that was actually good. For the Gibbs, this was both a gift and a curse. It put them in the top tier, but it also threatened to overshadow what made them unique. The Bee Gees, and Barry especially, felt the pressure. They admired the Beatles, but they weren't trying to be the Beatles. As Barry fought to make sure their hard-won success was their own, this feeling of living in a giant's shadow, of not being quite good enough for the rock establishment, stuck around for years. The media loved the idea of a rivalry. Every chart battle was framed like a title fight. Paul McCartney himself, seeing the mania around the Bee Gees, once said, "I guess it's their time now," a comment that could be seen as either a generous compliment or just a fact. For John Lennon, the face of the rock revolution, the Bee Gees were maybe a bit more complicated. On one hand, they were part of the pop machine he was trying to break out of. The Beatles were off making psychedelic albums and political statements, while the Bee Gees were crafting beautiful, but more traditional, pop songs. And yet, you just couldn't deny the quality. This created a weird tension. There was no public fight, no insults in the press. The rivalry mostly existed in headlines. But for Barry Gibb, now one of the most successful songwriters on the planet, the ultimate validation would have to come from the top. To be accepted not just as a hitmaker, but as a peer. Meeting John Lennon wasn't just about meeting a celebrity, it was about meeting the king, the guy who wrote the rulebook and then tore it up. It was a chance to finally step out of that long shadow. All of this pressure, all of this comparison, came to a head on one single day in London. The day the new Prince of Pop would finally meet the king. The date was March 30, 1967. London was the center of the cultural universe, the heart of the swinging 60s. And on this day, a huge moment in rock history was happening. At a studio in Chelsea, the Beatles were posing for the cover of their next album, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. This wasn't just a photo shoot, it was the creation of an icon. The four Beatles, in bright, psychedelic military uniforms, stood in front of a collage of their heroes. History was being made in that room. Later that day, the action moved to one of London's most legendary nightclubs, the Speakeasy. This was the inner sanctum, where rock royalty like the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and The Who came to hang out. Barry Gibb, in a 2010 interview, described the club's vibe. "It was virtually a closed club," he recalled. "You went downstairs and there was a coffin, and if you were someone they knew, the wall would turn around, and in you would go." It was a real-life wonderland for the rock elite. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. Barry, just 20 years old, was the new kid in town. The Bee Gees were on fire, and he was now a member of this exclusive club, rubbing shoulders with his idols. He remembered seeing Rolling Stones lying around all over the place. It was surreal. And then, he saw him. Across the room, holding court, was John Lennon. According to the story, he was still in his bright satin uniform from the Sgt. Pepper's shoot, an unforgettable sight. For Barry, this was it. This was the man whose music had changed his life, the yardstick he was measured against. It was Pete Townshend of The Who would connect their two worlds. After a couple of drinks, Townshend turned to Barry and asked the question he'd been hoping for, "Do you want to meet John?" Imagine the anticipation. What would they talk about? Songwriting? Would Lennon acknowledge the Bee Gees' success? Townshend led a hopeful Barry across the crowded room. As they got closer, they could see Lennon was deep in conversation, totally focused. Townsend made the introduction, "John. This is Barry Gibb, from the group The Bee Gees," and then, the big moment. John Lennon, without breaking his conversation, without turning around, and without even looking at Barry, tossed out a quick, dismissive "How ya doin' dot." Some versions of the story say he might have added a "pleased to meet you" before immediately turning back to his guest, leaving Barry standing there. That was it. The entire encounter. Decades later, Barry Gibb would tell the story with a laugh, protecting himself from what must have been a crushing moment. "So I met John Lennon's back," he famously quipped. "I didn't meet his front." The story is both funny and incredibly revealing. It says so much about the strict hierarchy of the 60s rock scene. The Beatles' inner circle was notoriously tough to get into. For a young Barry Gibb, who was already insecure about his place in the rock world, this cold shoulder from King Lennon could only have made him feel worse. He was the new prince in town, but the king didn't even bother to look at him. The meeting he had built up in his mind had dissolved into a brutal, casual dismissal. This story shows so much about the pressure of fame and the reality behind the music. If you're loving this deep dive into rock history, please take a second to subscribe for more stories you've never heard. And let us know in the comments. What's your favorite song by the Beatles or the Bee Gees? Now, back to the story, because what happened after this encounter is what truly defines the truth about Barry Gibb and John Lennon. For years, that chilly non-meeting was the only known interaction between Barry Gibb and John Lennon. It would have been easy to assume Lennon just didn't care for the Bee Gees, seeing them as pop lightweights. The story of a cool rivalry, or at least a total lack of connection, seemed to be confirmed. But the truth was far more interesting, and it would come out years later. In one of John Lennon's final interviews, the 1970s flipped the script for both acts. The Beatles broke up in 1970. The Bee Gees, after a brief split and a few slow years, completely reinvented themselves. Barry Gibb started using his high-pitched falsetto, creating a sound that would define an era. With Saturday Night Fever in 1977, the Bee Gees launched into a level of stardom that even rivaled Beatlemania. They owned the charts. But with that success came a massive backlash. The whole disco sucks movement unfairly targeted the Bee Gees, painting them as sellouts. It was during this time, in 1980, in a long interview with Playboy magazine, that John Lennon was asked a direct question. The interviewer brought up the idea that all rock music was just the Beatles redone. Lennon's answer was thoughtful and completely unexpected. "All music is rehash," he started. "There are only a few notes. Just variations on a theme." And then, he did something amazing. He specifically chose the Bee Gees as his prime example. Try to tell the kids in the 70s who were screaming to the Bee Gees that their music was just the Beatles redone. There is nothing wrong with the Bee Gees. They do a damn good job. There was nothing else going on then. Let that sink in. This was John Lennon, rock's ultimate rebel, in one of his last major interviews, publicly defending the band that rock snobs love to hate. He didn't have to. He could have agreed, or picked any other band. But he chose the Bee Gees. He praised their craftsmanship, acknowledged the joy they brought millions, and recognized how important they were. This one moment completely changes the story. The cold shoulder at the speakeasy probably wasn't a judgment on their music, but just a reflection of Lennon's own guarded, often prickly personality. The real truth wasn't about friendship, it was about professional respect. Lennon, the master, recognized the work of other masters. He understood what it took to write a song that connects with millions, whether it was a psychedelic trip or a disco inferno. He saw past the genre and heard the quality, and this is the real truth of the story. For decades, people guessed it was rivalry or friendship, but it was neither. It was a quieter, more meaningful connection, professional respect. Barry Gibb had always revered Lennon's talent. And John Lennon, in the final year of his life, publicly validated the Bee Gees' talent and their place in history. He defended them when they were under attack, a gesture of solidarity from one musical giant to another. So, what's the final truth about Barry Gibb and John Lennon? After peeling back all the layers of myth and time, the answer is simpler and more profound than we thought. It isn't a sensational tale of a secret friendship or a bitter rivalry. The truth is much more human. Their only encounter was a non-event, an awkward moment that left a young Barry Gibb feeling like an outsider. For years, that's all the story was, a tale of a cold shoulder. But the real story, the one we can now piece together, is about unspoken, professional respect. It's the story of John Lennon, the ultimate iconoclast, publicly defending the kings of disco when it was the least cool thing to do. In one of his last interviews, he praised their work with undeniable admiration. Today, at 78, Barry Gibb can look back on that moment in the speakeasy not with the sting of rejection, but with a lifetime of wisdom. He sees it for what it was, a brief interaction with a complicated man. The more important connection was never going to be made over a handshake in a loud club. It was forged in the grooves of vinyl records, in the shared language of chords and melodies, and in the mutual understanding of what it takes to make music that lasts forever. The relationship between Barry Gibb and John Lennon is a powerful reminder that the stories we think we know are often just sketches. The truth is in the details, in the work they left behind, and in the quiet moments of respect that echo louder than any chart battle. What do you think this story tells us about fame? Does a personal connection between great artists even matter, or is the music the only conversation that truly counts? Share your thoughts below.